Welcome to Myth and Magic. Grab your cozy socks, weather permitting, pour your favorite drinky drinks, and put on your crown. Today we are focusing our lens on one of the most beloved of fairies. We are going into the glittering aristocracy of the fairy world, the Trooping Fairies of the Seelie Court. We are stepping into the grand processions, the eternal summer feasts, and the rigid, regal etiquette of the High Fae nobility. To understand the Trooping Fae, we have to look at how original folklore categorized the fairy realm. The term trooping stems from the Old English and Scots traditions, used specifically to contrast the entities that are the solitary fairies, like brownies or leprechauns. While solitary fairies lived alone and handled domestic or localized tasks, the Trooping Fae traveled in massive, organized, and deeply hierarchical crowds or troops. In Ireland, they are most famously called the Dina Shi, meaning the people of the mounds. In Scotland, they are the She, and in Wales, they are the Tulwith Teg, which translates beautifully to the fair family. Every linguistic root associated with them highlights their collective social nature and their high aristocratic status. The historical origins of the Trooping Fae are deeply tied to the shifting landscape of ancient belief systems. According to the foundational Irish manuscript, the Book of Invasions, the Trooping Fae did not simply pop into existence. They were born the Tuatha De Danann, a race of highly advanced magical gods who ruled Ireland. When the Malaysians, the ancestors of humans, invaded, a great war was fought. The Tuatha De Danann lost, and as part of the peace treaty, the world was divided into two. Humans took the surface, and the gods took the world below, often called the other world. The Tuatha De Danann, or the Trooping Fairies, retreated into the ancient prehistoric burial mounds, which we now know are not exactly burial mounds. My husband and I were able to visit one of these in Ireland, and it's very fascinating. It's a whole different thing. If you are interested in that historical aspect of lore, let me know. It is really interesting, really cool, and the history of how it went from one thing to another to now what we know it actually is pretty cool. However, these fae went into these burial mounds and barrows dotting the countryside. Upon entering those hollow hills, they transitioned from active deities to the Trooping Fae. In the folklore of the Scottish Highlands, their birth is continuous. They are an immortal dynasty that reproduces within their kingdoms, keeping their royal bloodlines pure and completely separate from the mortal world. However, in traditional folklore, there were times when the Fae did marry mortals. While they had their own royal dynasties and strictly looked down on mortals, their interactions with humans for marriage or romantic pairings were deeply rooted in specific pragmatic reasons. According to historical records and folk studies, like those of Lady Wilde and Catherine Briggs, there are three primary reasons why the Fae would steal humans for marriage, along with the specific types of fairies who did it. Firstly, there's the Trooping Fae. The most common reason found in Celtic and British lore is that the Fae were a fading, static race. Because they were immortal or exceptionally long-lived, their bloodlines would become stagnant, weak, and prone to deformity over the centuries. The Trooping Fae stole vibrant, beautiful, and healthy humans to introduce mortal strength and new genetics into their lineage. This process was viewed almost like a genetic tune-up, to ensure their supernatural beauty and vitality would not entirely die out. In Christianized folklore, it was also believed that they needed human red blood to somehow help secure a place for their offspring on Judgment Day. So these were the Trooping Fae, the Dina Shi, Ireland, and the She, Scotland, the high nobility of the Seelie Court. They were notorious for abducting exceptionally handsome young men and beautiful women right before their weddings, or taking healthy human infants to raise as the future mates for their nobility. Fairies were also deeply vain and obsessed with things they could not easily produce themselves, such as raw human passion, physical warmth, and mortally driven creative talent. A fairy ruler would occasionally develop an intense, possessive fascination with a mortal's exceptional beauty, musical talent, or artistic grace. They didn't steal them out of love in the human sense, but rather out of a desire to own them as a prize or a spouse who could entertain the court eternally. There are some arguments that Fae do not actually love, but that it is this deep possessiveness that is their version of love. So the Fae who would do this are the high-ranking fairy monarchs, like the classic King Orfeo or the Earl of Yarrow tells. They would use a glamour or place a spell over a mortal to lure them into a fairy ring or hollow hill, making them forget their earthly lives entirely. The third one I want to save for our next video when we talk about the solitary fairies. They have very different reasons as to why they would want a companion, a mortal companion. So we'll go into that in our video after the storytime video following this one. Now, interestingly, folklorist records show that these marriages rarely lasted forever. According to many regional tales, after a set period of time, often 7 years, once the human began to age or lose their youthful luster, the Fae would often return them to the mortal world, frequently giving them gifts of prophecy, healing, or magical knowledge as compensation for their time in the fairy realm. When we look at original records, the appearance of the Seelie Trooping Fae is dazzling, sharp, and intensely intimidating. Forget the modern image of tiny winged sprites. The high nobility of the Seelie Court almost always appeared human-sized or slightly taller, possessing an otherworldly symmetrical beauty that was often described as difficult or painful to look at directly. They had pale, flawless skin, sharp, aristocratic features, and long, gleaming hair that caught the light like spun gold or silver. Their clothing was a massive status symbol within the court, woven from green silk, velvet, and gossamer, often trimmed with threads of real gold. When they traveled, they rode magnificent snow-white steeds whose hooves made no sound on the grass, their bridles decorated with tiny silver bells that chimed softly in the wind. The overarching purpose of the Seelie Trooping Fae is the preservation of beauty, high art, music, and the courtly traditions of chivalry. They embody the zenith of nature's growth, the endless warmth of late spring and high summer. However, their personality is defined by an absolute, unyielding pride. The Seelie Fae are completely amoral by human standards. They do not operate on a spectrum of right and wrong, but rather on a spectrum of honor and insult. Within the Seelie Court, manners are weaponized. They demand flawless etiquette from each other and from any human unfortunate enough to cross their path. They are intensely territorial, deeply vain, and view humanity as a fascinating lesser species, useful for entertainment, but inherently disposable. And I would be fascinated to write the challenge of this very specifically, like to capture all of this the way that traditional folklore describe, and yet still find romance in it somehow. I don't know. I think that's what Holly Black did in The Cruel Prince, but I'm not exactly sure. I still need to read it. Maybe that will be my next one because I keep saying that. The powers of the Trooping Fae are vast, rooted in the manipulation of nature and perception. Their primary attribute is the glamour, a high-leveled illusion magic that can make a rotting underground cavern look like a golden banquet hall, or make a handful of dead leaves look like solid gold coins. They also possess absolute control over localized time and space. Their greatest attribute is the fairy revel. When the troupe rides out on nights like midsummer, they establish a fairy ring, a circle of dark green grass or mushrooms, which we mentioned in our previous video. Within this ring, they play enchanting, irresistible music. Any human who hears it is drawn into a trance, forced to dance with the troupe. Because the Fae control the flow of time within their boundary, a human might dance for what feels like 10 minutes, only to step out of the ring and find that 80 years have passed in the mortal world, which again, we talked about this in our previous video. Historically, the Seelie Trooping Fae are accompanied by specific symbols that represent their royal status. The silver bells. The sound of silver bells ringing in a quiet forest is the universal folkloric warning that a fairy procession is passing by. What you want to do with that information is entirely up to you. The white steed, symbolizing purity, nobility, and high status within the Seelie Court. And then there's the green and gold. I was very purposeful in my choice of clothing today. These are the official colors of the Seelie nobility, representing the peak of summer vegetation and the wealth of the earth. In traditional woodcuts and early illustrations, they are never depicted as whimsical. They are shown as solemn, regal knights and queens moving in long, orderly lines through the forest, carrying banners and looking down upon the human world with cold indifference. Now, historically, humans never built temples to the Trooping Fae because you do not worship something that might destroy your household over a missed polite greeting. Instead, worship took the form of absolute appeasement. Communities practiced strict taboos. You never spoke the word fairy, as it might draw their attention. Instead, you called them the gentry, the good neighbors, or the fair folk. In modern spiritual practices, particularly with the revivalist Fae faith and neo-pagan traditions, this has transformed into a structured respect for the land. Modern practitioners create outdoor altars, offering traditional items like local honey, sweet cream, and unsalted butter. The focus is on environmental stewardship, as modern practitioners believe that respecting the natural world is the only true way to maintain a positive relationship with the Seelie Court. And this kind of goes to show how they went from the Tuatha De Danann gods, who very much had worshiping practices for them, which if I have a Celtic playlist of gods that I've started, I might add more as we go. But you can go and see how that looks very different to how they are as Fae. Now, if you want to be able to see the traditional fairy trooping Fae being featured in film and books and other things, here is a list that you can go check out. First, there are the Dresden Files series, specifically Summer Night and Cold Days by Jim Butcher. This urban fantasy series features an incredibly detailed breakdown of the Seelie and unseelie courts. The Trooping Fae are depicted exactly as traditional lore dictates, as powerful, human-sized, beautiful, and bound by absolute laws of debt and etiquette. I have a friend who I believe read the books and said they were really, really good. Also, I believe there's a table RPG game called the Dresden Files, and it has this same kind of focus. There's also Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susan Clark. This historical fantasy introduces the gentleman with the thistle-down hair, a high-ranking fairy royal who perfectly embodies the amoral, vain, and manipulative nature of the traditional Trooping Fae, complete with magical balls and human abductions. And then, as I mentioned before, The Cruel Prince, the Folk of the Air series by Holly Black. While popular in young adult fiction, this series heavily relies on traditional folklore. It showcases the complex hierarchy, royal courts, grand revelries, and the dangerous politics of the human-sized, non-human-minded Fae. In television, there is again Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. It's a BBC miniseries. The television adaptation of Clark's novel visually brings the traditional Seelie dynamics to life. The depictions of fairy magic, the lack of wings, and the hypnotic, dangerous nature of the fairy revels are incredibly accurate to original folklore. Now, this one might surprise you, but I remember this. I have seen this movie. Hellboy 2: The Golden Army. Directed by Guillermo del Toro, this film features Prince Nuada and Princess Nuala, who are explicitly written as members of the Tuatha De Danann. They are portrayed as an ancient, regal, and fading race of hidden magical royalty dealing with the modern world. Carnival Row on Prime Video is a series that features high-ranking aristocratic Fae refugees, referred to as the Picts, who struggle to maintain their cultural nobility, court traditions, and complex social hierarchies in a gritty industrial human society. This is one that I've been wanting to watch, but I do not. Wait. I married my husband. He has Prime. I need to check on this. In video games, there's Kingdoms of Amalur, Re-Reckoning. The fantasy RPG divides its immortal Fae population directly into the Summer Court and the Winter Court. The Summer Fae perfectly mirror the Trooping Fae, obsessed with grand ballads, cyclical rituals, courtly honor, and preservation. The Witcher 3, The Wild Hunt, Blood and Wine expansion. This game frequently touches upon Slavic and Celtic folklore. While the main game features solitary hags, the Blood and Wine expansion introduces environments and entities deeply inspired by the deceptive glamour and courtly nature of traditional European fairy realms. And then there's Changeling, the dreaming / changeling, the lost. A tabletop RPG. Part of the World of Darkness universe, these tabletop games are entirely centered around player characters navigating the complex aristocratic politics of the Seelie and Unseelie Court houses, using traditional concepts like the glamour and changeling abductions. And that is all. We have just discussed the complexity of the Trooping Fae. This, I think, is something that a lot of writers just either don't know about or ignore, and they kind of just don't utilize what could be a very interesting, obviously successful idea of what traditional Fae, Trooping Fae, High Fae are like. I definitely need to go read The Cruel Prince. I might be also diving into a couple of other ones. The Dresden Files, as far as I understand it, is a longish series. I could be wrong, but there's that. Anyway, that is the end. The next video will be story time. I hope you have enjoyed this little deep dive into the Trooping Fae, the High Fae. Maybe it's changed your perspective on them. And that is it. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Please be kind, please be safe, and I will see you next time. Bye.